Let me ask you a question that most leadership programs probably never ask. Who are you when nobody's watching? I don't mean the version that shows up on stage, maybe in the boardroom, on the conference calls, at the school gates, not the leader that the team sees or the woman the organization needs you to be. Who are you when the room is empty? That title is gone. The role completely, stripped away, and it's just you. Because here's what I have observed after, more than 2 decades of working with women leaders across the world. The most significant leadership crisis most women face is not even a skills gap. It's not about, having, a wrong strategy. It's not a confidence issue, even, although sometimes it might look like that on the outside. After over 2 decades of working with women leaders, I've come to know that it is indeed an identity crisis, a very deep, quiet uncertainty about who they actually are when everything external is removed. And you cannot build sustainable leadership legacy on a foundation that you have never examined. Well, you're welcome again to the Nations of Women podcast. I'm Dr. Tina Allton, an educational psychologist and your leadership coach. This is our brand new series, The Now Woman Journey. And so today we're going to start at the foundation because that's where everything starts. So, ready to build? If you're running on the treadmill or going for a walk with the dog, or if you're in your office, then grab a piece of paper or your notepad or whatever it is and, come on a journey with me. Identity is really the answer to the question, who am I? Who am I at my core when everything else is removed? For most leaders, that question actually is uncomfortable because the honest answer is most would say, I'm not sure. I know what I do. I know what I can produce. I know how I can perform. I know what others need from me. But who I actually am beneath all of that, I've never fully stopped to examine. Perhaps you're one of those leaders that is thinking the same. I know I used to at some point. But then this is a leadership problem, not necessarily a personal one. It's a real leadership problem because how you lead is a direct expression of who you believe you are. How you lead is the direct expression of who you believe you are because it shows in your decisions, your communication style, your tolerance or your, for risk, how you even handle criticism, how you treat people when you're under pressure. All of it flows from your identity. So if you get the identity wrong and everything built on top of it, then becomes unsustainable and unstable. Think about the year 1173. Well, I say think about, but you can Google what happened in the year 1173. That's the year construction began on the Tower of Pisa in Italy. The design was absolutely ambitious. The craftsmanship was exceptional. But the builders had a problem they had not fully understood at the time. The soil on the other side of the foundation was softer than the other. So the structure began to tilt before it was even completed. 800 years later, engineers have worked to stabilize it. But the lean, though, still remains. The Leaning Tower of Pisa is now a tourist attraction. But it was never meant to lean. It was meant to stand tall. Like many women leaders are building impressive structures on foundations that were never properly laid. And the lean, I dare to say, shows up eventually. What do you mean, Tina? It shows up maybe in burnout, broken relationships, and decisions that perhaps were made from a place of insecurity rather than like really being truly, clear in your mind. The now woman, though, builds on solid ground. And solid ground starts with knowing who you are. And I just want to clarify, identity is not your job title. It's not what happens to your sense of self when you are in a role, right? Your job title is what happens to your sense of self when the role ends. Then are you lost, or do you know who you are? Identity is also not your performance. And what happens then? Perhaps maybe you fail publicly, or maybe you end up with results that are far below, standards that you're capable of. What happens then? Right? Identity is not other people's opinion of you. If you think of it, what happens when people you maybe respect withdraw their approval, right? It's not your relationship status even either. What happens then if family dynamics change or shift? The question remains, who are you at your core? Identity is the part of you that will remain when all else is removed. And for the now woman, that foundation is not built on what she does. It really is truly built on who she was made to be, who she was created by God to be. The most secure leaders in the world share one quality that has absolutely nothing to do with their IQ or their experience or even network. They just know who they are. Their sense of self, of who I am, doesn't shift with the opinion of other people in the room. They can be criticized, they can be challenged, they can be opposed. But one thing remains, they remain grounded. Not because they're arrogant. Yes, of course, there's some who might be, but it's just simply because they know their identity of who God has created them to be. And being settled in your identity starts really with anchoring yourself in something, the one thing that cannot be taken from you. And we know that is on Christ. And the Bible tells us in Ephesians, 2:10 that even before we were born, God planned in advance our destiny and the good works that we would fulfill, we would do in order to fulfill these good works. Before you were born, that is when your identity was established. God had great plans for you. Wasn't necessarily, by your parents or culture or, employer or worst critic. Of course, they kind of, shape us in some way or form, but that's not what makes us who we are. What makes us who we are is the one who made you with a full knowledge of everything that is ahead of us. That we would, fulfill a specific purpose, a specific, what do you call it, space in this world. That we would make a specific contribution in the world that only we could because we were created specifically. God planned it in advance. That we would do good works and everything in between that it would take us to do in order to fulfill those. Now, when you think about Nelson Mandela, he spent 27 years in prison under conditions designed to break his sense of self. But when he walked out, he was more settled in his identity than even when he went in, because his identity was not built on his freedom. It was built on something that his captors could never reach. That is the standard. That is the foundation on which we're building. And this is the foundation of the now woman. This is where she builds from, and it's absolutely unshakable. There are two ways to lead. Either you can lead from your identity, the woman that God created you to be, your identity in Him as a daughter, or you can lead from performance. Either way, they both produce completely different results. The performance-based leader is constantly managing. You're managing, how you're perceived, your results, how you look, how, your team looks at you, or people's opinions, you name it, or even your own, self-criticism. Every decision that, she's making carries that weight of it. How is this? What does this say about me? It is exhausting. Not because she's, some weak person. No, because it just means you're carrying this humongous load that really was never meant to be that way. However, though, the woman who leads from the place of this is my God-given identity is completely different. You can make decisions based on values, not on, opinions. You can absorb criticism without collapsing. You can fail and you'd be able to recover quickly because your sense of self was never attached to any outcome. You lead from a full cup rather than constantly a depleted one. When you're leading from your God-given identity, you can make decisions faster because you're not going to be paralyzed by fear of how it's going to be perceived. This is who God has called me to be. This is, what I'm created to do. Of course, we all have to, grow in our character and in our, what do you call it? Strengths and skills and all of those things. However, you're not paralyzed by fear because you know that in order to get to that place of fulfilling the purpose for which God created you for, there is a process you must go through, and that includes character development. But you're in a joyful state of being able to walk through that journey and that process without fear. When you lead from that place of identity, you actually attract like really high caliber, high quality people because you're secure in who you are. And you will last much longer because you're not running on external validation. Of course, we all need, people to tell us if we're doing well, because it's just part of being human is, hey, you see somebody doing great and you're able to say, you're doing amazing. Thank you for what you're doing. Thank you for, persevering. Thank you, whatever it is. It's good to hear those things. And it's good for us as leaders to be able to give those as well. But we don't live our life and we don't lead from that place of needing that approval or external validation because you know the God that created you approves of you because that's who He says you are. You're approved. You're a son, you're a daughter, you are approved. You can develop quickly and more effectively because you're not threatened by those around you who are equally growing and pursuing to increase in their character or who they are. Now, I grew up in Ghana, and in those days, you'd constantly and consistently hear as a girl that, like, you have no authority, no voice, no right to lead. I don't think I even remember a single woman in government or in a real high position. Of course, there were head teachers and nurses and matrons and all of those things. So the external pressure to really build your identity on compliance, it was so high. But there was an internal resistance, right? There was an internal resistance. That knowledge, even as a little girl, as a young lady, it really helped me. It helped me at really difficult points to not necessarily succumb to the culture of who I needed to be. But having said that, for years I carried that pressure of culture that we don't do that or we don't do this. That external expectation didn't leave, suddenly one day. It took time. It took time. And as I grew, both in age and in maturity, in understanding and really coming to that place of wanting to pursue my God-given identity, that is when everything changed. So I want to ask a couple of questions, and you just got to be honest. These are, in my opinion, indicators, and indicators are useful. If you think of a car, you're driving and you want to turn left, it's really helpful to put your indicators on because it helps everybody else around you to know that you're coming to the left. Likewise, if you're turning right, even when you're riding a bike, it helps the other road users to know, that, hey, I'm taking a right turn or a left turn, and it means that you're safe and you keep everybody else safe. So indicators are good. Indicators are good. So maybe a critical comment from a colleague or from a client, right? Does it stay with you for days or weeks, or are you able to kind of like shake it off very quickly? Do you find it difficult to make significant decisions without like seeking validation from multiple people first? Do you kind of like hold yourself differently, depending on who's in the room? Maybe adjust your voice, your tone, your posture, your opinion. Of course, all those things are important because, they're setting places. I've had the wonderful honor and privilege of, working with, presidents of nations and government ministers and high caliber people. And of course, in those rooms, you have to hold yourself in a certain way. But that's not what I mean. What I mean is when you're in a room that really matters, do you pretend to be something you're not? Be honest. Do you avoid certain conversations or making certain decisions because you're actually more concerned about how people are going to think of you rather than, what, this is the right thing to do. This is what I need to do as a woman of integrity. I don't know. None of these necessarily make you a bad leader. They just make you a human. But they're the exact patterns that honestly can limit how far you can go. And the now woman really truly works on these things, not by trying harder, but actually by choosing to go deeper. And that is by choosing to pursue her God given identity. Who has God called you to be? Who were you created to be? And how do you need to grow? How do you need to develop to become that person? So, if you think of two trees, growing side by side, perhaps on an exposed hillside, some storms on that hill, storms come because it's just part of what the weather does. So one tree would bend, perhaps dramatically, maybe the branches would be whipping, crackling, eventually might be uprooted. Well, the other one too bends, but it doesn't break. It maybe flexes, absorbs a little bit of the force. And then after the storm passes, it stands again. The difference is not necessarily the trunk, it's the roots. The second tree that stood would have been sending roots deeper and deeper and deeper and deeper and deeper for years. Not because storms were coming, but because that is what trees do when they're growing well. So leaders who bend without breaking in difficult seasons are not stronger by nature, but they're stronger by deeper by discipline. Their roots go far down than anyone else can see. And that is what your identity can produce. The roots that hold well when everything above ground is being tested. So, what roots are you laying down? What roots are you laying down? What kind of disciplines, habits are you building? How are you developing your character, yourself, whilst you are, on that journey to becoming the woman that God has created you to be? So, some questions for us to think through and reflect on. If your job title, your role, or your results perhaps were all removed tomorrow, who would you be? And you really want to answer that question with some confidence. Where is your leadership currently or most vulnerable to the opinion of others? In what rooms? Maybe with what people? What situations make you feel unstable or least, capable? What's the earliest message that you received about who you are, perhaps growing up as a young woman, or maybe even not too long ago? And are you still holding on to those words? Is it by chance impacting the way you lead? What would change about how you lead this week if you were completely stable and settled, strong, confident in who you know God has created you to be, regardless of, feedback or results or who's watching, regardless of anything? What would change? So maybe you might want to write your identity statement. It's not your job description, it's not about your achievements. But you can complete this as a leader. I am XYZ at my core. I am dash at my core. I lead from dash. When everything external is removed, what remains is dash. And you want to read it out aloud every morning before you even check your phone. Identify one decision perhaps you've been delaying this week because you're managing how it's going to be perceived, rather than, hey, this as a woman of integrity, this is what I need to do, and make that decision today, irrespective of people's opinions. And you want to notice every time this week that you're just who you are based on who is in the room. Just make a notice of that. Not to judge yourself or to punish yourself, but awareness is going to be your greatest gift as a leader. So go back to your identity statement, write it down, refine it, return to it daily, daily, daily for the next 21 days. Because it will help you to be able to state and know who you are at your core, very clearly defined by God's opinion of who you are. And go back to, Ephesians 2:10. If you were planned, or not if, you were planned in advance, your contribution was considered by God long before you arrived. Lead from that truth that God planned for me well in advance. He had good works for me to fulfill. And the final assignment this week or homework is subscribe to the Nations of Women podcast so you never have to miss again. And share with others as well, because when you share with others and they're able to listen and subscribe or leave a review, it helps. It makes it worth our time. And remember though, you cannot lead others further than you have led yourself. And you can't lead yourself further than you know yourself. And finally, also, performance-based leadership will exhaust you. But when you're leading from your identity of who God says you are, that is what will sustain you. So the leader who knows who she is cannot be shaken by what she faces. Some final food for thought. Every leadership program in the world will teach you strategy, communication, team management, execution, all of those things. But very few will ask you to sit down with this question: who are you? It's not what you do, not what have you achieved, not what others need from you. It's who are you at your core, beneath the title, beneath all those results. Why? Because the answer to that question is the foundation on which everything else is built on. And as a leader, who perhaps has never examined that foundation, you're always one hard season away from discovering it, that your foundation is never as solid as you thought. Now, before GPS, um, before satellite navigation, before any of the technology we now, really take for granted, sailors navigated by compass. The compass did not tell the sailor where to go. It simply told them where north was north. And knowing where north was with certainty, regardless of the weather, regardless of, visibility or how disorienting the sea had become, meant that the leader could always find their way. Your identity is likewise your compass. It doesn't tell you every decision to make, and it doesn't map out every step of your life or your journey, but it tells you where your north is, who you are, what you stand for, what you will not compromise on when the sea gets rough, which it will do because it does for all of us. A leader with a compass finds her way, and a leader without one simply drifts. So here's your question for this week. Do you know where your north is? And are you leading by that? If this episode perhaps opened something up to you or stirred you in some way, then subscribe to the podcast so you never miss again. Because we're going to be going deeper and deeper and deeper every week. And if it also has challenged you, then I want you to write into us or share it with other people because it helps other leaders to find this community. And if you want to know more on how we can help you as a leader, then visit our website, nationsofwind.com, and join the community there. Next week, we're going to go even more deeper, looking at, okay, so I found my north. What next? We're Nations of Women, and our passion really, truly is to develop women leaders who are influential in all spheres of society, but really leading from the place of their God-given identity. Until I see you again next Tuesday, remember, before you can lead anyone else, you have to win that battle first. Knowing who you are, your God-given identity, and you lead from that place. Until then, stay faithful, stay focused, stay bold, and remember to go all in. And that's all for this week.